The Monkey's Paw by W. Jacobs, Part 4. The next morning, Mrs. White, Herbert, and Mr. White were enjoying their breakfast. "I suppose all old soldiers are the same," said Mrs. White. "The idea of our listening to such nonsense. How could wishes be granted in these days? And if they could, how could 200 pounds hurt you?" "Might drop on his head from the sky," said the frivolous Herbert. Morris said the things happened so naturally that you might, if you so wished, attribute it to coincidence. "Well, don't break into the money before I come back," said Herbert as he rose from the table. "I'm afraid it'll turn you into a mean, vicious old man, and we shall have to disown you." Herbert went out the door and went on his way to work. During the day, Mr. and Mrs. White continued on doing their daily chores. "Herbert will have some more of his funny remarks, I expect, when he comes home," she said as they sat at dinner. "I dare say," said Mr. White, pouring himself some beer. "But, for all that, the thing moved in my hand. That I'll swear to." "You thought it did," said the old lady soothingly. "I say it did," replied the other. "There was no thought about it. I had just— What's the matter?" His wife made no reply. She was watching the mysterious movements of a man outside, who, peering in an undecided fashion at the house, appeared to be trying to make up his mind to enter. In mental connection with the 200 pounds, she noticed that the stranger was well dressed and wore a silk hat of glossy newness. 3 times he paused at the gate and then walked on again. The 4th time he stood with his hand upon it, and then, with sudden resolution, flung it open and walked up the path. Mrs. White, at the same moment, placed her hands behind her and hurriedly unfastened the strings of her apron. She brought the stranger, who seemed ill at ease, into the room. He gazed at her furtively and listened in a preoccupied fashion as the old lady apologized for the appearance of the room. "I was asked to call," he said at last. He stooped and picked a piece of cotton from his trousers. "I come from Ma and Megan's." The old lady started. "Is anything the matter? Has anything happened to Herbert? What is it? What is it?" Her husband interrupted. There, mother," he said hastily. "Sit down and don't jump to conclusions. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, sir." "I'm sorry," began the visitor. "Is he hurt?" demanded the mother wildly. The visitor bowed his head. "Badly hurt," he said quietly, "but he is not in any pain." "Oh, thank God," said the old woman, clasping her hands. "Thank God for that. Thank God." She broke off as the sinister meaning dawned on her. She saw the awful confirmation of her fears in the other person's averted face. She caught her breath and turned to her slower-witted husband, laid her trembling hand on his. There was a long silence. "He was caught in the machinery," said the visitor, at length in a low voice. "Caught in the machinery," repeated Mr. White, in a dazed fashion. He sat staring out the window and taking his wife's hand between his own, pressing it as he had been wont to do in their old courting days nearly 40 years before. "He was the only one left to us," he said, turning gently to the visitor. "It is hard." The other coughed and, rising, walked slowly to the window. "The firm wishes me to convey their sincerest sympathy with you in your great loss," he said. "I beg that you will understand I am only their servant and merely obeying orders." There was no reply. The old woman's face was white, her eyes staring and her breath inaudible. The husband's face was such as his friend the sergeant might have carried into first action. "I was to say that Ma and Megan's disclaim all responsibility. They admit no liability at all, but in consideration of your son's services, they wish to present you with a certain sum as compensation." Mr. White dropped his wife's hand and, rising to his feet, gazed with a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips shaped the words, "How much?" 200 pounds was the answer. Unconscious of his wife's shriek, the old man smiled faintly, held out his hands, and then dropped to the floor in a heap, unconscious. Please tune in to Part 5 of The Monkey's Paw.